Now, a few years ago, noting that the rest of England was suffering from this, the SNP thought, I know what we can do. We'll say refugees welcome here in Scotland, knowing that none of them are going to come to Scotland, but we can virtue vent, we can virtue signal about what wonderful guys we are because we believe refugees are welcome. What they never really thought would happen was that refugees would actually take them up on the offer. And so there are now thousands of refugees in Scotland with a legal claim to social housing that the fools on the SNP-led Glasgow Council have got to find accommodation for, are legally obliged to give social housing to. Now, this whole thing is absurd, and we're writing a book at the moment on how to change all of this. And one of the policies is that if somebody, that I would advocate, is if somebody gets refugee status, then they do not get full access to the British welfare system on the same terms as a British citizen. They have to pay their own way, which means they need to find somewhere to live, but they can't claim benefits. They can't claim housing benefits. Yeah, they can get a job, but they have to pay their own way. And you know what? That would stop a lot of people claiming asylum in the first place, because so many of these so-called refugees are just economic migrants who are hoping to get accepted as a refugee in order that they can then live largely on the British benefits system. So that needs to stop. It needs to be that if you're given refugee status, you pay your own way. And if you can't pay your own way, you have to leave. And you don't need to go home, but you can't stay in this country. You need to leave. That needs to become the new way of dealing with refugees, because it's utterly absurd that they are given the same rights as a British citizen. This right, by the way, that they have once they get refugee status is written into the UN Refugee Convention. That's why we have to give them these rights. So long as we are members of the UN Refugee Convention, we have to treat an official refugee in the same way as a British citizen, essentially. That has to end. And it's really only going to end when we leave the UN Refugee Convention and we set up our own asylum and refugee rules, which will be much more prohibitive, but will make sure we get far less people trying to game the system.